Hi everyone, welcome to week 9 of UOSS. This week we are going to be looking at integrating others' work into your writing, specifically summarising, paraphrasing and quoting. And so what we want to do is we want to kind of introduce to you these different ways that you can incorporate the work of others into your own writing, and also go through some of the kind of nuts and bolts of integrating research. So this is the first of 3 videos, and this one I'll go through some main points, 7 to be exact, to take into account when you're using someone else's work. And this is really hopefully will help you to decide when and how to use and integrate information. And then in the second video, I'll go into referencing, specifically what is referencing, how to referencing, and the final video will look at reporting verbs. Okay, so the first main point when kind of deciding how to use and integrate information would be to think about how the information is relevant to your thesis and your argument, or your argument. And I think it's really important here to remember that if a piece of information or evidence doesn't directly contribute to your argument, then it doesn't actually belong in the assignment, no matter how interesting you might find that information. And it's very easy when you're reading, you're researching, to kind of be fascinated by all this interesting material and these interesting facts that may even contribute to your understanding of the topic generally. But are they helping you, convince the reader of your argument in this case, or are they helping you kind of do the assessment task and answer that question? That's the real thing you need to ask yourself. So the information must be relevant. That's perhaps the key, actually, key point to keep in mind. And I've mentioned this one before. Topic and concluding sentences should be in your own words, meaning that you don't begin or end paragraphs with evidence or quotations. And you can think about this in a number of ways, but I think it's also helpful to think about, if you're starting off with a quote or a quotation, the reader has no idea where that's going. They've had no introduction to that evidence or that quotation. There's no sense of why it's there. It's kind of like trying to have a bit of mystery. So, and as we said before, that's not what academic writing is. And so they're just kind of left wondering a bit, well, where's this going? And if you end with evidence or quote, similarly, the reader's expecting you to kind of elaborate or to say something more after that. So, just remembering that the kind of those underlying principles about academic writing and how everything is to be really clear, really kind of well structured and systematic. Having these kind of quotations or evidence kind of just sitting at the beginning or the end of a paragraph without an introduction, without elaboration, is really kind of, is not doing you a good service in your writing. The next point is that research should be properly integrated. Now, what do we mean by that? There are some tips here. One is to avoid a floating quote. So this is dropping into a paragraph a quotation but without any connection or explanation. So it just kind of sits there and it's like the reader's being asked to figure it out themselves. And I always think that when I see this, a student isn't sure what to do with that quotation. They maybe have an idea it's relevant, but they're not quite sure what to say about it. And so it looks as though, in the worst case, it's using someone else's words to buff up your paragraph without you doing the work. In the best case, it might be that the student's just struggling a little bit with expressing what they want to say about that quotation. So it's really important in that sense to always think about, how you're going to introduce it, how are you elaborating, how does this quotation connect to the previous, idea you had, what was in the previous sentence, what you've been developing over that paragraph and over that essay. Another tip is to make sure quotes fit grammatically into the paragraph. So this is something that can be a bit challenging if you're still kind of, if grammar's not your strong point, this will be a bit harder, and it's something to really keep in mind. This is to make sure that when you actually take out that part of that quotation, that the way you introduce it, it actually fits entirely in with the grammar. So it can't just be that the grammar needs to fit within the quotation that you have, but it also needs to fit within your entire sentence. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Another point is to use signposting. So I remember before, the way we talked about this is kind of like if someone's reading your essay and it's like they're driving along a road and they have signs that direct them where to go. So we use transition signals and, or phrases, if you will, to help link, to help guide the reader to make sense of your ideas and how they relate to one another. And so with research, how that comes in is introducing the research, especially quotes, and by using reporting verbs and phrases, which the third video will address in more detail, and to link the research to the discussion with transition signals. So linking that kind of point of that evidence and showing the relationship between the evidence and your actual your interpretation, your critique, whatever it is that you're making of that point. So whatever you're discussing, that it's clear that how that research actually relates to that point. Okay, so the next point is to engage with the information, and this means rather than just inserting a piece of information, a paragraph, without engaging with it, we're asking you to do something with that, whether it's explain it, analyze it, disagree with it, connect it to the other information. But you shouldn't be expecting or allowing the information to do the arguing for you. So you must be the one to kind of make this connection and make these connections, and to explicitly relate the research to your argument. And so here, for example, we've got some different ways of engaging, whether it's explaining, refuting, building on, relating to the argument, and next to that, some transition signals that indicate this, to the reader, and help them make sense of this connection. So in other words, on the other hand, in addition, therefore, thus, or this suggests that. And so use transition signals essentially to make this connection really explicit to the reader, and show that you're doing the work, with this information. You're not just letting it sit there and essentially make the argument for you. The next point is to follow the correct referencing conventions. So there's a couple of things. I think first off, you've got to know what referencing system is being used. Often it's Harvard, but that's not always the case. It'll depend on your faculty. It may depend on the school as well. So it's always worth checking if they're okay with you, which one you're supposed to use first, and if they're okay with you selecting, then you get to pick which one you think is the best to use, or the one you feel most comfortable with. I'll go into more detail with referencing in the next video, but for now it's just important to say that you need to use the appropriate in-text citation, especially differentiating between, say, if you have a summary or a paraphrase, and whether or not you need to have page numbers is very important. The other thing is to make sure that you use quotation marks correctly. That means using them at the actual beginning of the quote and at the end of the quote, and not, say, kind of starting them somewhere later in, and then actually you've got some text there that looks as though it's in your own words, but it's actually the first part of the quotation. The correct formatting too. And this is for long quotes, usually over 3 lines. You indent the entire quote. So you separate it essentially from the paragraph, and that makes reading easier, makes it easier to follow. So we'll go, as I said, we'll go in much more detail in the second video about referencing conventions, but keeping in mind that this is one of the key, this is one of the nuts and bolts of integrating research. Okay, now I've mentioned this one before as well, making sure your own voice is very clear. So there's a couple of tips here we can give you. One is to not draw too heavily on the ideas of others. So again, this comes back to that engagement in the previous one of the previous points. You know, if you don't have enough explanation or analysis of those ideas, then you're letting those ideas do the work for you. So not drawing too heavily. And not drawing too heavily on the words of others. So this is if you have too many quotations, and this looks very obvious to a marker when they see your work, and there's simply just endless quotations. And you know, the first thing I think when I see that is, wow, the student has, you know, they've relied on this other people's words, and you know, they might, these quotes, even if they were great, in a sense, they've not done anything with them. They're not showing me what they think about these and how this relates to, you know, to the assignment task, how this relates to the question that they're being asked, you know, to answer, or the task they're being asked to do. So for me, that's always a red flag if I see that. And it usually comes up actually as being very heavily weighted in Turnitin. You know, the percentage is really high, the match, because, and so that's a good indicator if you're in a subject where the lecturer is allowing you to see your submission to turn it in the plagiarism match before. That's actually can be quite a helpful tool for you to realise that you need to go back and maybe engage more, or maybe even cut out some of those quotes in the first place. But when you're looking through your own work, make sure to really try and think about quotations. Are they necessary? Am I drawing too much on other people's ideas? And maybe going through with a highlighter yourself in a draft, highlighting in one colour all the quotes by someone else, and then highlighting in a different colour or your own writing, and that will give you a bit of a sense of this, whether or not you're relying on someone else's words. Similarly with ideas, that would be a good kind of, you know, exercise to do to realise this. Avoid encapsulated serial summaries. So what do we mean by this? We mean kind of that each paragraph should make a point relevant to the argument, not just summarize a single source. So avoid this structure, which is every paragraph equals one source summarized. Try instead to be thinking about, you know, what's the point I'm making, and which kind of evidence, which information helps me make this point. And you should be trying to, when you're doing that, trying to draw on at least 2 different sources of information per paragraph. And you can draw upon, you know, remember, you know, a reading is a source of information. You can draw upon that reading in more than one point. You know, so first paragraph can refer to, in our case, for example, Milner Davis. Second paragraph can refer to Milner Davis. It's the information itself that should be the focus, not the source. When you're you know, writing out, when you're thinking about how you're going to structure your paragraphs, and make connections between the sources. So within those paragraphs, thinking about how are they similar or different. You know, how is this kind of, you know, interpretation of this information? Is it different? Is there some sort of distinction or connection I can make there? Okay, so in this next few slides, I'm going to go over what is a summary, a paraphrase, and quotation. So, starting with a summary involves briefly rewriting someone else's ideas in your own words, and the key word being there, briefly. So a summary includes the main points. It leaves out the details and examples, so it's not interested in those really, you know, the bits that kind of, you know, explain everything, that you know, give it, you know, in some sense that make it more convincing to you as a reader. That stuff's all left out. It retains the meaning of the original text, very important, and is shorter than the original text. So a summary can be of many different kind of lengths. It can be a page, a chapter, and it can even be a whole book. And this is so it's a very good kind of skill to have, to be able to summarize longer sections, and it does require you to really understand the original meaning, but it also then to kind of condense that into a much shorter version. So you might want to, when you're practicing this, to try and start small. Can you summarize one paragraph? Can you summarize one page, and then just to go from there to kind of work on how you do this. So what's a paraphrase? A paraphrase involves rewriting someone else's ideas in your own words. It retains the meaning of the original text like a summary. It repeats all the key information in the original text, unlike the summary. So this is not just the main points, this is not leaving out the details, rather it has all the key information. And it can be as long as the original, or sometimes longer. So paraphrase, unlike a summary, is for the short sections of work, a sentence, a couple of sentences, or a very short paragraph. And I wouldn't recommend, in your own work, doing this, say, for a paragraph or something, because that would just take up such a huge amount for your essays. In most cases at university, what you'll be paraphrasing will be 1 or 2 sentences. That'll be, in most cases, what you'll be doing. So with this one, again, understanding the meaning of the original text is fundamental, as is being able to identify the key information, because this is what you need to repeat. But then what you need to do is you need to put it into your own words. And that's something I think that's quite challenging. And in term 2, I believe we go into some activities where you get to practice this in both summarizing and paraphrasing. But yeah, so it takes a bit of practice putting this into your own words, and in a sense still making it different, from the original, that you're not plagiarizing it. Okay, so finally, what is a quotation? A quotation is reproducing word for word someone else's ideas. So quotations must appear between quotation marks. This is absolutely critical. Unless they are long block quotes, which we'll discuss in a second how you deal with that. But the quotation mark should always be distinguished as someone else's words. It should be used when the author's exact words are important. That is to say, you cannot put them into other words, and because the exactness of those words are very critical to that point, to that meaning. And also when you want an authoritative voice in your writing. So a quotation is exactly the same length as the original text, unless parts are omitted using an ellipsis, so the 3 dots. So in this sense, it's very different as well from the other two, in that it's exactly the same. And if you remember when we were doing note taking, this is something that you should be thinking about also when you're making your notes of sources. Is there a quote there that's really critical, and the way they've worded it is just perfect to that meaning, and there's no other way I can reproduce this, and I think I'm going to use this, so thinking about this also with your note taking is helpful. But a quotation is exactly that. It is the exact words. The meaning for that reason is less, unlike in a summary and paraphrase. We're not saying here that you reproducing the meaning, the original meaning, is important because it's a quote. The meaning's already there. It's actually the relevance of the quote. Why have you chosen to quote rather than to paraphrase or summarize is the key question that you need to ask when you're selecting quotes for your essay. Okay, so in the next video, I'm going to give you samples of summaries, paraphrases, and quotations in a paragraph. But for now, we need to look first at referencing to see actually how we cite those sources. Okay, see you in the next, well, don't see you, I just speak to myself in the next video.